And I think we're all back. All right. So let's jump into what was discussed in your breakout rooms. We have what was Glissant's thesis with the open boat, what was Glissant up to with abyss as a metaphor, and what questions you may have had about the readings. Who wants to start us off?
Yeah, I could do it.
Okay,
Yeah, just give me 1 second. I'm sorry, I just need to move something.
sure, sure.
Yeah, so I'm not too sure if this is the correct thesis, but in my opinion, I thought it was pretty interesting. How the reading mentioned that a lot of what they were talking about isn't written down. It's like passed through oral history because everything that was written down from um, the enslaved people being slaves and being a commodity rather than human beings.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And when I get into my notes, James, I'll go into that a little bit more detailed. Anybody else want to add on to that or talk about what they thought the abyss meant or what he was doing with the abyss, Glissant? Angel, what did you guys discuss in your breakout rooms? Angel Martin, what was discussed in your breakout room? Fabian, how about you? What was discussed in your breakout room, Fabian?
We discussed how like the the abyss metaphor like shows like their loneliness on their trip to like wherever they go.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Anyone else? What questions do you guys have about the reading? What was discussed in that portion of the conversation?
I had a quick question about like the paragraph on like specifically the abyss, where it talks about the beginning of like the abyss is marked by like the metaphor of the balls and chain gone green. Like I don't know. I kind of had like trouble understanding that exactly. Like I know it mentioned earlier in the paragraph, like the green splendor of the sea. Like I just didn't really like. I just didn't like the connection didn't make sense in my head. I just yeah, that's
Okay.
it.
Um, hmm. Well, let me do this, Lynette. When I get into my notes, I'm gonna go into my notes now, and then I'm gonna address that specifically, and I'm gonna put a note to kind of talk about that a little bit more.
All right, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So let's get into it then. What the book that you guys pulled the passage from that you read is entitled Poetics of Relations. The author is Edward Glissant. He is a Martinican poet, intellectual, philosopher, but he was intellectually trained in France. So the original publication of the book was in French, but then it was republished with an English translation by Betsy Wing. So knowing that, I think about Somme's claims that anytime that there's a translation from one culture to another culture, there's been a bit of violence that ensues, right? So we have to understand that we're receiving this text through somewhat of violence of the translation. Um, so I'll read the opening passage to start off my notes. We know that this chapter is entitled "The Open Boat," and he states that for the Africans who lived through the experience of deportation to the Americas, comma asterisk, confronting the unknown with neither preparation nor challenge was no doubt petrifying. So, as I said, comma, asterisk after the Americas, this is what I mean. So you see here the Americas, you see the comma, and then you can see the little asterisk, right? This asterisk is an end note that lets you know to go towards the bottom of the page where you'll see the same asterisks, but at the bottom of the page. These are notes that are going to give you more information about what he's stating at the top, right? So after the asterisk on the bottom of the page, the end note states, first of all, did anybody read the bottom of the page knowing that what that was for, the connotation behind that asterisk? Did anybody engage that part? Okay, cool. All right, perfect. So I'm going to read that and we're going to unpack that portion of the page. So asterisk, then it starts, the slave trade came through the cramped doorway of the slave ship, leaving a wake like that of a crawling desert caravan. It might be drawn like this. And he gives you the line with like the 3 departing images on each end, right? And he says, African countries to the east, land of the Americas to the west. This creature is in the image of a fabril. Now, the second paragraph is really where it gets interesting. African languages became deterritorialized, thus contributing to the Creolization of the West. So I'm from Ghana, West Africa. My language is Akan. I get kidnapped from Ghana, placed on this ship, and I'm transported to the Americas. So my African language of Akan becomes deterritorialized and transported to the West. I'm from Nigeria. I speak Igbo. I'm captured. I'm placed on this ship, and I'm transferred to the West, right? So my Igbo African language is deterritorialized outside of outside of Africa, and transported to the West, right? Not necessarily weakens, Ashlan, but it's literally transported, right? Because if an individual who speaks a certain language is picking up and dropped off in the Americas, he or she is taking that language with them, right? And I don't want to say weakens, but it gets further convoluted. I'll put it that way. And as I move through, I'll explain why. So that's the deterritorialization, right? And he says that this leads to the Creolization of the West, okay? This is the most completely known confrontation between the powers of the written word and the impulses of orality. So when you hear orality, think of the ability to orate, right? The ability to speak, the ability to sing, the ability to shout, scream, say a poem, rap, beatbox, right? Those are all elements of orality, right? So here, there's a confrontation at play between the written and the oral, okay? The only written thing on the slave ship was the account book listing the exchange values of the enslaved. Again, the only written thing on the slave ship was the account book listing the exchange values of the enslaved. Okay, so that's what's been written. Within the ship's space, the cry of those deported was stifled. What does it mean to have something stifled? What does stifle mean? What does it mean? Go ahead.
Isn't it kind of like accounted for?
Nah. So if your cry is being stifled, go ahead, Ashlan, say that out loud for me, please.
Suffocate.
Yep. To suffocate, to stop, to limit, to prevent, right? So that cry that's emanating from the enslaved Africans in the belly of the ship is being stifled, okay? And he says, as it would be in the realm of the plantation, right? So the cries are being stifled on the boat, and they will be continued to be stifled on the plantation. This confrontation still reverberates to this day, right? So there's 3 forms of confrontation at play. The first confrontation is between the written and then the oral, right? So what is the only written thing on the ship? The only written thing on the ship is what?
The accounting book.
The account book, right? The receipts that say how much individual was purchased for, right? So this ledger, this account book, by definition signifies the inhumanity of the enslaved Africans who are listed in this book, right? That is in confrontation with the cries of the Africans who are becoming stifled. So think about this. When a human being is injured, what does it do? It cries out, right? You get hurt, you might shout. You get hurt enough, you might cry, right? You have the written, which signifies your inhumanity because it signifies how much you were purchased for, right? By default, making you an object. You have the oral, the cries that signify your humanity. Because only human beings, for the most part, by and large, can cry out when they're in pain and they're in distress. So this is the first confrontation at play. The second confrontation is the stifling of the cries, the desire to mute these cries, right? Then the final, and he says, in that confrontation will carry on into the plantation, right? And then he says that this confrontation, the stifling of the cries, that still carries out till this day. And that's the third depiction of that confrontation, how that plays out today, how we stifle the cries of the human beings today. What that may look like today is Black Lives Matter. All lives matter. Blue lives matter, right? Because Black Lives Matter is to signify an individual's humanity, right? But then they'll come back with some bullshit and say, well, of course all lives matter, or the blue lives matter. What is a blue life? What even is that, right? So that's a stifling of the cries for humanity, okay? From there, he shifts into his conversation about the abyss, and this is where we'll get into Lynette's question. So there's three phases of the abyss. There's three metamorphoses of the abyss, right? He says, first, the time you fell into the belly of the boat. For, in your poetic vision, a boat has no belly. A boat does not swallow up, does not devour. A boat is steered by open skies. Yet, the belly of this boat dissolves you, precipitates you into a non-world from which you cry out. This boat is a womb abyss, right? So we know that the first abyss is the boat. It's the belly of the boat. That's the first abyss, okay? So the next abyss, and this is where we get to Lynette's question. I'm going to read the passage, but then I'll read the whole paragraph so that way we can get to Lynette's question. The next abyss was the depths of the sea. Whenever a fleet of ships gave chase to a slave ship, it was easiest to lighten the boat by throwing the cargo overboard, weighing it down with balls and chains. These underwater signposts mark the course between the Gold Coast and the Leeward Islands. Okay, so let me ask you guys, what is the cargo that's being thrown overboard?
The people.
The individuals on the boat, okay? And they're weighing the individuals down with ball and chain to make sure that they are pulled to the bottom, right? That they can't swim away, that they can't float, that they're pulled to the bottom of the ocean. So we know who the cargo are. We know that the cargo are being weighed down with balls and chains. Then he continues to say, these underwater signposts. What is a signpost?
Like a marking of place, kind of.
Absolutely. Okay. And that marks the course between the Gold Coast, which is the west coast of Africa, to the Leeward Islands, which is in the Western Hemisphere, right? So if we think about it like this, you're on the 10 freeway, you're going west. You got Adams, you got Crenshaw, you got La Brea, you got Fairfax, right? Those signs let you know where to exit. Those signposts let you know where to go, right? So Glissant is saying that the Atlantic Ocean is literally filled with bodies of enslaved Africans that will give you a direction on how to navigate from the west coast of Africa all the way to the Americas, right? So just how we have exit signs on our freeway, Glissant is saying underwater, there's signs of bodies of dead Africans who have been thrown overboard that will allow you to navigate from the west coast of Africa all the way to the Americas, right? And then towards the bottom, in actual fact, the abyss is a tautology. And the entire ocean, the entire sea gently collapsing in the end into the pleasures of sand, make one vast beginning, but a beginning whose time is marked by these balls and chains gone green. So he's saying that this experience, this happenstance, right? The entire sea gently collapsing into the end, in the end, into the pleasures of sand, makes a beginning, right? So what that is talking about is this phenomenon is the production, is the start of the Western world, right? Because we know that America's economy started from what? How did America get its economy started? How did capitalism in America start? What was the first capital in America?
Slaves?
Say it again, Margaret.
Slaves?
Slavery, yes. That was the first institution that started America's economic enterprise, right? And he says that it makes one vast beginning, right? But a beginning whose time is marked by these balls and chains gone green. So the balls and chains are on the feet of the Africans who were thrown overboard, right? And if something sits at the bottom of the ocean for so long, what happens? It's going to turn green with algae. It's going to turn green with rust, right? Time is going to turn those ball and chains green. Does that make sense, Lynette?
Yeah, it makes total sense. Thank you.
Okay. And then, so that's the second abyss. We know that the second abyss is the depths of the sea, right? So in Glissant's articulation, the depths of the sea is littered with bodies of African people because the enslavers are throwing those bodies overboard, right? But what is not talked about are African individuals who chose to jump overboard opposed to being oppressed in the system of enslavement on the plantation, right? For those who've seen the movie Black Panther, think about Michael B. Jordan's closing line, throw me in the ocean with my ancestors who chose to jump overboard opposed to being in chains, right? So that's also a phenomenon that took place. In fact, that was such a phenomenon that the slave masters, the enslavers, would put provisions in place to make sure Africans would not jump overboard to avoid the abyss of the plantation. So we know the first abyss is the boat, the second abyss is the ocean. The next abyss, we know, becomes all that gets left behind. So when you're snatched up from the west coast of Africa, you leave behind a lot of stuff, right? And Glissant is saying that's the third abyss, right? He says, thus projects a reverse image of all that had been left behind, not to be regained for generations. So I'm a descendant of Africans, right? Generations before me, right? I'm the descendants of these Africans. I cannot go back and trace where my family lineage started. I cannot go back and trace the language that my lineage spoke, right? This is what he's talking about when he says never to be regained for generations. All that's been left behind. Feeling a language vanish. The words of the gods vanish. And the sealed image of even the most everyday object vanish, right? That's the third abyss, all that you cannot go back and get, all that you were stripped from, right? So those are the three changes of the abyss. We have the boat, we have the ocean, and all that is left. Okay. And then he continues on page 7. Go ahead.
I just wanted to ask a quick question.
ahead.
I understood that the first abyss was the bottom of the boat, but what does it represent?
So, so one, also with the abyss, a very flat understanding of the depth of the abyss is the unknown, right? That's another way that he articulates the unknown. So the bottom of the boat, the belly of the boat, is one. Let me try to think about this. If you can kind of put yourself in that situation, right? Like you just going through your everyday life, you at Housestead LA in front of the library chilling, right? Somebody just snatch your ass up and put you in this bottom of this boat. You don't know what's going on, right? So you don't know where you're going to. You don't know what's going to happen to you next. So there's an uncertainty there that produces fear, that produces angst, that produces grief, right? So that's why the belly of the boat becomes important. And then and that's why he says, right, yet the belly of this boat, it dissolves you. Think about what it means to be dissolved. It eradicates your whole being, right? It participates you into a non-world from which you cry out. This this is boat is a womb, right? What is a womb, right? This is where you're birthed from, okay? A womb abyss. It generates the clamor of your protest. So you're protesting because of the situation that you're put in, right? So because somebody snatched you in front of that library, Jesse, that's going to cause you to protest. That circumstance is going to cause you to cry out and say, yo, this ain't right. Let me go, right? So this is
Would you also
go ahead.
would you also say that it's kind of like a long-term thing, maybe like a kind of vengeance or a kind of like a kind of sense of vengeance or revenge for like a while, something that's like internally like within you, like that
Yeah,
kind of protest?
it will produce that, right? I think if you are kidnapped and snatched up, vengeance is going to cross your mind, right? I think any natural functioning thinking individual is going to think, I need some get back for this, right? Like, in fact, me as a black person, I'm still would like some get back for that, right? Just to keep it 100, right? So yes, I would agree with that. I think it definitely produces that. But I think what he really wants us to understand is this sense of the unknown, right? And that's what he really wants you to get. And then, so if you think about it, when you jump into that water, there's also a sense of the unknown, right? To say, well, shit, I don't know where this boat is taking me, but I know I don't want to go there, right? I don't know what's going to happen to me if I jump in this ocean, but I'd rather try this ocean than what's going to happen to me on this boat, right? So is this unknown is a fundamental understanding of the abyss. Does that help you out, Jesse?
Yeah, a lot. Thank you.
Okay, bet. Okay, so and here's where the abyss shifts. Okay, so up until page, I would say the bottom of page 7, we have a shift in the abyss, right? And here's why. He says the population that then formed, despite having forgotten the chasm, despite being unable to imagine the passion of those who foundered there, nonetheless wove this a veil. They did not use it to return to the former land, but rose up on this unexpected, dumbfounded land. Okay, so let's deal with the first part. There's a population that's formed amongst this abyss, right? So again, I'm from Ghana. I speak Akan. I'm placed on this ship. Somebody else is from Nigeria. They speak Igbo. They're placed on this ship. We're chained together. It's dark. We don't know what's going on. We're hearing people crying. People are defecating on themselves. People are pissing on themselves. You don't know what's going on. So the natural response is to try to communicate with the person next to you to get an understanding of our circumstance. But again, we speak different languages, right? But you're going to find a way to establish some form of communication with that individual because your survival depends on it, right? So this produces a new population, right? This population that's produced, we now call them Africans and African Americans, which I call Africans in American, right? This new population that produce are what we now call Jamaicans, Trinidadians, Haitians, right? This is that new population that Glissant is talking about. But they formed a sail, right? So what does a sail do for a boat? What does a sail do for a boat? Not rhetorical, real question. What does a sail do for a boat? Why does you need a sail on your boat?
It helps it navigate around the ocean.
It makes it move, right? It's the engine to the boat. So what he says is they wove a sail, right? But they did not use it to return back to Africa, but rose up on this unexpected and dumbfounded land. So they use this knowledge, they use this information. Yep, Ashlan, that's the Creolization. Yep, exactly. Good call out. So they use that to build up information here, right? But what is the sail? And he'll tell you on the subsequent paragraph. It's knowledge. Right? The sail is knowledge, but not just a specific knowledge. Appetite, suffering, and delight of one particular people. Not only that, but knowledge of the whole. Greater from having been at the abyss and freeing knowledge of relation within the whole. Right? So it's not about the knowledge of me as an Akan from Ghana, right? It's the knowledge of I'm an Akan from Ghana, you an Igbo from Nigeria, but we're in this circumstance, right? There's a knowledge that's being produced by us being chained together. It's a knowledge that's being produced that when they take us overboard, not all of us come back. Excuse me, when they take us up on top of the ship, not all of us come back. They throw in some people over, right? There's a knowledge that gets produced when a woman is chained to another woman and she gives birth next to her, right? This is the knowledge of the whole, okay? For this experience made you original victim, floating towards the sea's abyss, an exception. It became something shared and made us, okay? So it went from you to us, the descendants, one people among others. Peoples do not live on exception. Relation is not made up of things that are foreign, but of shared knowledge. Relation is not made up of things that are foreign, but of shared knowledge. This experience of the abyss can now be said to be the best element of exchange. So again, it's not just about the specific knowledge of you and your ethnic background, but of this shared knowledge, right? The shared knowledge that the abyss produces, okay? And it says, it made us, right? The descendants, one people among others, right? So again, this shared knowledge of the abyss makes us this African diaspora, right? It makes us, again, Haitians, Jamaicans, black folks in America, right? Black folks in Europe, whatever the case may be. It's the abyss, the shared knowledge of the abyss that created this dispersal. And then he closes with this idea, this is why we stay with poetry, right? This is why we stay with poetry. Because poetry is able to do things with the English language that other language and other linguistics can't do, right? Poetry allows you to capture the emotions that straight essay writing does not allow to happen, right? Poetry attends for the violence that takes place within translation, right? If you think about Malidoma Patrice Somé, he says that there's things that happen in his culture that the English language does not have the words for. But poetry may be able to articulate that in a way that becomes useful for Somé, right? So for Glissant, the poetic is important. The poetic does to the English language what Creolization does to the English language. I'm going to end my notes there for sake of time. We'll transition into our fishbowl. Is there anyone who wants to volunteer for the fishbowl? Remember, you have one time to pass. You only have to do 2 per semester. Any volunteers?
I'll do it.
Okay, James, got you. Thank you. All right, well, then I'll call that random. Carla, are you prepared to fishbowl today?
Wait, can I do it too, mister?
Yeah, I got you, Fabian.
Okay.
Could I do too, Professor?
And Lynette. All right, so that'll be our 3. Carla, you're unless you want to, we'll give you a pass today. All right, so we have James, Fabian, and Lynette. Whoever wants to set us off, it's on you.
Yeah, so I thought the reading was pretty interesting. A lot of the metaphors, like I don't know if everyone felt this way, but like kind of like the metaphoric speaking that they used was kind of difficult to understand. But right now with the professor explaining it, I understood it a lot better. But I just think it's really crazy, in general, how people acted, back in the day, or specifically white people who were doing this. But yeah, and I still do think the main point, in my opinion, like the main thing of this reading was the fact that a lot of it wasn't necessarily written down, and I think there's like a big gap of like more information that, like, it was probably a million times worse than like we could imagine, but if it was written down, we would still have we still wouldn't understand how terrible it was, but we would have a better understanding.
Um, to add on, about like how like the confrontation between the written word and like the oral cries and everything. I think how James was saying that we wouldn't ever be able to understand necessarily, even if it was written down. I think that's kind of like, to me at least, that's kind of how like the poeticness of this passage kind of like bridged the gap, because it helps us like understand a little bit more, because it can paint violent pictures with violent words, to describe these like violent events and everything without having actual words that were written down back then. And one thing that definitely stood out to me was like the image of like the poetic womb, because like in our connotation, usually we think a womb of like new life and like a new start and everything. And even though that kind of stays true for this image, it's like it's described as a womb that carries and yet disintegrates the oral cries of the beings that it carries. And I don't know, I just thought that like that, bringing that image to something that seems so pure to our society, like a womb, really emphasizes like the back and forth that goes on in the ship.
Keep that womb comment in the back of your mind. When we finish the fishbowl, I'm going to type into that a little bit more. Baby?
Yeah, I agree. Like, I like the references they used in the story. Like the bow, like I feel like, and the abyss part, the metaphor, like the way they're just taken from their land and like just like set everything aside. They I don't know, I don't know how to say it, like they couldn't go back because they're kind of forced into it. And I don't know, that just stood out to me because we never know how like they go through these things and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Um,
Go
um,
ahead. I'm sorry.
I just wanted to add to the discussion just because I think it's interesting to talk about the last episode we were talking about, which is the knowledge of understanding. And I just feel like it really comes down to just how you live your life and the kind of wisdom that you gain. So, one may never be able to understand those kind of things. But for example, like if somebody were to ever um, become like homeless, right? And you went through some kind of drug addiction and stuff like that, and you have another person who may have gone through some kind of drug addiction, and they could have kind of lived that kind of life, right? I think that kind of reaches that same concept of understanding, and I feel like for other people, it's good for them to share their story, and you're able to you kind of get their viewpoint, right? And I feel that it's important to also realize that people might have gone through something similar, and those kind of emotions, thoughts, and experience are able to go an even further step to gain that understanding.
Jesse, thank you, man, because it's a great transition to kind of where I want to move in next. And that's going to kind of triangulate what Jesse said, what Lynette saying about the womb, and what Ashlan put in the chat about the creolization. So, speaking of creolization, there's actually a chapter in the book entitled Creolization. Is anybody familiar with Creole culture, the Caribbean, New Orleans? Anybody kind of familiar with that? Anybody got Creole in their family or anything like that? No?
Yeah, one of my parents is actually Haitian,
Okay.
but my other parent never really let us like immerse into that culture. So I've been trying to learn on it, like on it on my own. And I kind of met my family from that side for the first time the other day, actually.
Yeah, beautiful culture in Haiti. Oh my God, like the historical, man. Like if you can, Lynette, I encourage you to really do a deep dive because Haiti has given so much of the world, and the world takes so much from them. Okay, gumbo. Who's familiar with the dish gumbo? Anybody heard about that? I don't know if you put your pinky up like, yeah, that's me. Okay, Margaret, when you get a second, can you let us know what you know about gumbo, how it's prepared, possibly?
I know that it originated in the South. Correct me if I'm wrong, because I may be wrong. I love the dish. And then it's from Louisiana, I think. I'm not sure. Um, and you have sausage in there. You got a little bit of she can add some shrimp. Kind of like a stew,
Yeah. Yep.
and then you can mix it with rice. It's pretty good. I like it.
Yeah. So you're absolutely right, right? So it's a stew, right? So what's important with the stew is the broth or the roux, right? You can do chicken broth, you can do vegetable broth, beef, whatever you want. But you got your roux and you pour your seasonings in your roux, right? You let them sit 15, 20 minutes. So that way the seasoning the flavors from the seasoning infuse into the broth, right? So that creates its own flavor within itself. And then to Margaret's point, you throw your sausage in there, you throw your shrimp in there, crab legs, lobster tails, okra, rice, right? A little bit of Old Bay. If you like me, you definitely throw some hot sauce in that, Jones. And you let that sit for 45 minutes to an hour, right? Because just like with the seasonings in the brew, it's producing a flavor, right? The meats, the rice, the okra is sitting and it's producing its own flavor, right? And then after the time stewing, you have the dish with its own unique flavor unto itself that we call gumbo. Gumbo is a quintessential metaphor for this idea of creolization that Glissant is getting us to think about, right? So just as the spices sit within the roux for a certain amount of time, those Africans in the ship speaking different languages, sitting together for 9 months on that journey across the Atlantic, are creating their own language, right? And then when they go through their 9-month journey and they're dropped off in the Americas, and they come off the boat and they're presented on this land, and the people who are conducting them are speaking English, right? So the seasonings that they came up with to produce their own language on the boat is now being seasoned with something else that's English, right? And that's going to produce what we call Ebonics in the Americas, or what we call the African American vernacular in the Americas, right? Some Africans were on their 9-month journey and they were dropped off on the islands. The island that they are dropped off, the people who are running that island are from Britain, so they have their own version of English, right? So you have the language that they created on the boat infused with the British English, and that's going to produce the patois that the Jamaicans speak, right? Some people are on the boat for 9 months and they get dropped off at another island. This island speaks French, right? So you have the language that you produce on that boat to communicate with one another, sprinkled with the French language, and now you have the Creole language that they speak in Haiti, right? So again, when he talks about these new populations that are being produced, this is the gumbo this is the creolization, the gumbo metaphor, right? So for Glissant, when you talk about this womb that Lynette is pointing us to, right? A womb gives birth to newness. The abyss, if you pay attention to how it shifts towards the end of the chapter, the abyss is about the production of newness, right? Because that's the shared knowledge that that the individuals on this boat have, is the experience of the abyss. So that womb abyss produces a new population, which we call African Americans, Jamaicans, Haitians, etc., etc., etc. So this birthing metaphor that Lynette is attentive to, Glissant is doing that on purpose. He's telling you that something's being birthed in this boat's womb. A new population is being birthed on this boat's womb. And this population is being birthed through the experiences of the abyss, right? So when Jesse talks about being able to see somebody's circumstances and developing an understanding of those circumstances, what he's talking about is relation, right? You relate to someone because you can understand their circumstances, right? I'm Igbo, you're Akan, but I relate to you because we're both chained together on this ship. I understand your circumstance. So no longer is it about the difference. We can be warring tribes when we were back in Africa, but right now that beef is done. We can't deal with that beef right now. Our circumstances dictate that we have to deal with the circumstance at hand. That can produce a new knowledge, right? So this is what Glissant is really up to. This is the thesis. How could you take something tragic and terrible as the transatlantic slave experience, and study that, research that, excavate that, and be attentive to how newness was birthed. This is what he's up to. A lot of the Francophone African thinkers, and when I say Francophone, that just means you speak French. Going back to Aimé Césaire, who was from Martinique, who was the teacher of Frantz Fanon, who was from Martinique, who was the teacher of who Edward Glissant studied, right, who was from Martinique. They're all concerned with this project of developing the new human. So this idea of birth, this idea of newness becomes not only fundamental for Francophone African intellectuals, but it becomes a project of the Black intellectual tradition, right? So for the majority of your Black intellectual scholars are concerned with this idea of new production, right? This is what Glissant is getting us to think about. How can relations produce something new? We got 10 minutes left. I would like to hear from those who we have not heard from. Just curious as your thoughts, comments, concerns about the reading or the conversation that was had.
So, Professor, you're basically saying that newness was birthed through relations.
Yeah.
Meaning through the abyss.
Through the abyss. So the abyss is the relation that Glissant is focusing on.
Okay.
Right? That's one version of relation that we could look at, that Glissant is looking at, that he's saying, wow, this relation produced something new.
So would you say that that's the thesis itself? Like that okay, got it.
Yep. That's the thesis. And to be fair to y'all, right? I know that because I read the whole damn book, right? Y'all only got a chapter, so it's kind of hard to kind of extract all of what I've got gathered. I have a little bit more information to work off of. But yes, that would be the thesis of the book. And every chapter of the book is dealing with this notion of relation at a different capacity. Let me ask you guys this. This notion of relations. Glissant is focused on African people, right? And we can see how this notion is useful to eliminate risk between different ethnic groups within the African diaspora, right? So you're not going to be tripping on the fact that I'm Jamaican, you Nigerian, you Black American. We all have the shared experiences, so we're all going to unite based off of that, right? So let's take this to a broader context. We are, for the most part, I believe in this course, yes, for the most part, we're all members of marginalized communities, right? Which y'all may call minorities, I call marginalized communities, which means that we all went through our own type of abyss. So if you're indigenous, you consider yourself, Mexican, Latin American, Latinx, whatever you want to choose to frame that in, you have your own type of abyss, right? If you are an Asian descended individual, there's your own type of abyss that you've experienced, right? So all of these marginalized groups have experienced the abyss. How useful would it be for us as marginalized peoples to use these forms of abyss to gather ourselves, to unite ourselves? What would that produce? What newness can be produced by all marginalized groups, all so-called minority groups, focusing on their abyss as forms of relations to bring themselves in unity? What would that do for our society?
Maybe like the creation of a majority, not necessarily numbers, because how people call us minorities now, it's not because of numbers, it's because of our marginalization, but like the creation of a non-marginalized, greater, like bigger, greater community.
Yeah, absolutely. Who else? Who else wants to add to that? Think about this question of power, right? Because if you're talking about changing something, in this world, you can't really talk about changing some shit unless you're talking about power, right? So what would this notion of relations for all marginalized groups, how would that shift power?
I might be completely wrong, but maybe kind of like when a politic is part of that marginalized group and it's kind of an understanding, might be able to gain more power through their position to get that position or get an influence to get there.
Absolutely. See, okay, let's take your example, Jesse, because you're right. let's just say all marginalized groups voted as a one block, right? So black folks, brown folks, yellow folks, we all vote together. So we're all only going to vote for the person who's going to support our interests. That's going to vastly change the political sphere. The next subsequent presidents are going to look a lot different, and they're going to be talking a lot different if that's how marginalized groups operated. Think economically. What if all the marginalized groups pooled their economic resources together? This whole system of capitalism would be turned out on its head, right? So there's a benefit for those in power for us not to take on these notions of relation, for us not to identify with the similarities that we have across communities. Is anybody familiar with the situation of the Haitians in Texas at the border? Y'all heard about that?
Yeah, I'm very familiar.
Yeah, so this is what is beautiful about that for me. When I read an article that's saying a lot of the indigenous people on the Texas border are now feeding the Haitian migrants, right? Think about that. Indigenous people, what some may call Mexicans, right, are feeding, going out of their way to feed the Haitians who are trying to migrate into the Americas. Why do you think that is? It goes back to what Jesse was saying. Go ahead.
Yeah, so the same people, uh, well, I guess the Border Patrol or ICE, they're playing wannabe, of the people who hurt the Native Americans, so or natives, because they're not all Native American, but so they know these people's ancestors, so they're protecting them from what they experienced.
Yeah. I think on a deeper level, you're right, James. Go ahead, Margaret. Go ahead. What you think?
I was going to say that they kind of share the same abyss because they know their ancestors have gone through that and they're going through that. So now they've all shared something similar. So now you have a population that's going to help someone that they've you get what you get my drift? I don't know how
Absolutely.
to say it.
No, you're spot on. You hit it. That's
Okay.
it. Yeah, that's it. Right. So, and think like, let's be real. Like, let's have a real ass conversation right here. We're in California, right? And especially if you're in areas like Long Beach, there is a beef between black folks and Mexicans. Let's call it what it is, right? But those in Texas said, fuck all that. I'm not worried about you being black. I know what it's like to be a migrant. I know what your abyss is. So I'm going to help you out regardless of the circumstances. I'm going to help you out. That may put me at risk on my migration status here, right? But I know what it's like to be in your shoes. So I'm going to provide you food. That's what's in my power. That's what's in my control to do. So that's what I'm going to do for you. That's relations, right? And that's how this notion can change the world. They don't have to do that. They don't have to feed these Haitian people. When no one else in this hemisphere is showing any compassion to these Haitian people, they down there feeding them because they know what that experience is like. And that's the importance of relation. That's why we literally, if y'all know this or not, the whole time we've been in class, I've been talking about relation. Because that's how important that is. That's how we can change the state of this planet. By focusing on our similarities, not our differences. Okay. So let me show you guys what we're jumping into for next week. Give me 1 second, y'all. All right. Okay. So we are now in weeks 8 through 11. We're reading Zornell Hurston's Of Mules and Men. It's not a hard read, but it's going to be difficult because of the language and the phrasing. So think about what we're talking about this week in this idea of creolization, right? Think about how you're in the boat for 9 months. You develop your own language with the mixed languages that are on the bottom of that boat. You get dropped off in the Americas, then you're introduced English, right? So if you go through that experience, you might come out producing a paragraph that sounds like this. Y'all been telling and lying by all these varmints, but you ain't yet spoke about the high chief boss of all the world, which is the lion. right? So this is that Ebonics, that broken English that I was speaking of. So you're gonna really situate yourself in this Ebonics because we got about 8 pages of reading that's gonna read like that. So I would encourage you to read it out loud because it's gonna make more sense when you hear it auditorily opposed to it being in your head. Like it's gonna be hard to read this in your head and really get a sense of what he's trying to say. It's gonna really help you to read it out loud. But you'll get through it. I think if y'all could get through Glissant, you could definitely get through this passage here. But just know that this is what we're dealing with in the way that this is phrased out. So that's the reading for next week. I'll also email that to you guys by tomorrow or Friday, but at least this way you have the opportunity to jump ahead.